For all we know of history, most of it was not particularly pleasant or peaceful. Nevertheless, it is an archaeologist's job to dig up our past both figuratively and literally, regardless of how uncomfortable or even downright abominable it turns out to be. These next entries highlight just how gruesome some archaeological findings can be. Number 10. Child sacrifice in Carthage. On the subject of Carthaginians being so merciless that they would ritualistically sacrifice their own children to the gods, this is what Roman historian Diodorus had to say. He claimed that in the city of Carthage there was a bronze statue of Cronus with his hands extended, palms up. All babies placed within would roll down into a pit of fire. The historian even made mention of rich families who brought poor children and raised them specifically for this sacrifice. For millennia, this practice was considered so heinous that it was dismissed as propaganda by the Romans and the Greeks. But then archaeologists found the proof in cemeteries called toffets. The toffets contained tiny cremated human bones packed into urns and buried underneath tombstones with inscriptions that gave thanks to the gods. Some archaeologists have made the argument that these were not victims of child sacrifice, but rather beloved children who died after birth. While this would certainly be a more pleasant thought, the Oxford team that published a study on the topic categorically dismissed the idea. The inscriptions on the tombstones asked the gods to hear my voice and bless me. Some urns contained animal remains, which had definitely been sacrificed and were buried in the exact same way as the children. Finally, the discovered skeletons were far too few to represent all the stillbirths and infant deaths that would occur in a city the size of Carthage 2,000 years ago. The study declares the evidence in favor of child sacrifice as overwhelming. Number 9. What sunk the Hunley? The H.L. Hunley has a memorable but tragic history. It is hailed as the first submarine to sink a warship in combat on February 17, 1864. This happened when the Confederate Hunley attacked the USS Housatonic, a Union sloop of war which was blockading the port of Charleston, South Carolina. 5 crewmen of the Housatonic perished as the ship sank, but so did the 8 men aboard the submarine. In fact, 21 people died in total on the H.L. Hunley, including the engineer the boat was named after. It sank on 3 separate occasions, each time taking the crew with it. On the 3rd occasion, the fate of the Hunley turned into a 130-year-old mystery. It disappeared on its way back home following an attack on a Union vessel, and its location remained a secret until 1995. The wreckage was finally recovered in 2000, and since then, researchers have been arguing over what ultimately doomed the submarine and its crew. When the wreck was salvaged, an archaeological team made an eerie discovery. All the skeletons, they were still at their stations. The emergency failsafe had not been activated. This suggested that whatever destroyed the Hunley either killed or incapacitated the crew, as they made no attempt to escape. At the moment, the prevalent theory is that the Hunley's demise was caused by its own spar torpedo. This primitive version was simply attached to a long pole which the submarine rammed into an enemy ship. A modern recreation suggested that the blast was powerful enough to incapacitate and even kill all the men instantly. Number 8. Daggers made out of humans. Up until late last century, warriors from New Guinea used bone daggers in hand-to-hand combat. They were often made from the thigh bones of large flightless birds called cassowaries, but there were also some which were rarer and highly prized. These were made from human bones. These recovered weapons were made from the remains of men of high status. Usually they were the fathers of warriors who presumably donated their bones willingly. These daggers were worn prominently on the biceps, and the ones made from human flesh were more intricate. This conferred to them more of a ceremonial status than a practical one, but anthropologists wanted to know which type of weapon was actually better. They tested 11 daggers, 6 cassowary, 5 human, and found that the blades, made from human remains, retained more of the natural curvature of the bone and were far stronger. Number 7. The Battle of Tollense Valley. Back in 1996, an amateur archaeologist roaming the grounds of the Tollense Valley in northeastern Germany stumbled upon a single human arm bone. He didn't know it yet, but there were over 10,000 more bones waiting to be discovered there, as he had just uncovered the earliest known site of a major battle in European history. Radiocarbon dating placed the artifacts in the 13th century BCE during the early Bronze Age. The original arm bone had an arrowhead embedded in it, which suggested a fight. An initial small-scale dig quickly revealed more remains with signs of violence: a skull that had been bashed in by a club, more weapons, and a thigh bone with a fracture consistent with a fall from a horse. This warranted further investigation, and the site has been routinely excavated since 2008. Since then, archaeologists have found over 13,000 bone fragments, most of which were human and belonged to young men. Hundreds of soldiers died on the Tollense Valley battlefield in a fight that likely involved thousands. It was on a scale previously thought impossible for that region and that time time period. It forced historians to reconsider the complexity and the violent nature of Bronze Age societies, which up until that point didn't appear to be that concerned with warfare. Number 6. The Lloyds Coprolite. Not all horrific archaeological discoveries point to our murderous past. Some artifacts can shock for entirely different reasons. The Lloyds Coprolite, for example, might be the biggest piece of fossilized human feces in history. It was found in 1972 during excavation for what was to become a branch of Lloyds Bank in York, England. It is 7 inches in length and 2 inches in diameter and dates back to the 9th century CE. Fittingly, it came from a Viking who inhabited the settlement known back then as Jorvik. Microscopic analysis of the fossilized feces revealed traces of pollen grains and cereal bran. This indicated that its creator subsisted on a bread-heavy diet. The coprolite also contains the eggs of a parasitic worm. Now, they may not be pretty, but coprolites can provide us information about the health and diet of the average person from bygone eras that you could never get from books or scrolls. The archaeologists who specialize in this kind of study are called paleoscatologists, and the ones who studied the Lloyds coprolite regard it as precious as the crown jewels. Number 5. The vampire child of Lugnano. A few summers ago, American and Italian archaeologists were working side by side excavating a cemetery in Umbria. The burial place was known as the Cemetery of the Babies. Understandably, the work was already rather unnerving, but researchers made a particularly disturbing discovery. They found a skeleton of a child with a stone forced in its mouth in a rare and eerie example of a vampire burial. The child was around 10 years old, of indeterminate gender, and died 1,500 years ago. It was positioned on the left side and had a limestone about the size of a large egg stuck in its jaw. Cement had been plastered over the sides of the rock, and it still had visible teeth marks. Archaeologists believe this ritual was performed so that the child would not rise from the dead and spread malaria. Locals have called the unfortunate youth the vampire of Lugnano. Number 4. The Great Flood of China. Analysis of crushed skeletal remains of children suggests that China suffered a major flood around the same time as the Great Flood from legendary folk tales, which gave rise to the Chinese civilization. According to oral history, China was once heavily plagued by floods until a legendary hero called Yu the Great arrived. He put an end to the flooding and then founded the Shire dynasty, the first of the Chinese dynasties. There was never any historical evidence for this story until a few years ago when researchers found proof that suggested the Yellow River indeed suffered a massive deluge about 4,000 years ago. The team found remnants of a landslide which blocked the river in modern Qinghai province. This natural dam lasted for months, building a vast lake with all the water stored on one side of it. Finally, one day the dam broke, causing a flood powerful enough that it extended for 1,200 miles downstream. Unsurprisingly, this deluge was lethal, and archaeologists found the skeletons of 14 people, most of them children, who were crushed by the torrential waters. Radiocarbon dating of their bones put their death around 1920 BCE, which lines up with the mythical flood that birthed the Shire dynasty. While it is certainly not conclusive, it does lend credence to something which was previously considered to just be a legend. Number 3. Neanderthals and Cannibalism. Evidence recovered from multiple sites indicates that the Neanderthals not only practiced cannibalism but also fashioned tools from the bones of their own kind. A few years ago, archaeologists discovered 40,000-year-old Neanderthal skeletons in the Goyet caves in Belgium. Their bones had cut marks, pits, and notches, all signs that they had been butchered. Moreover, the bodies had been skinned and cut up and their bone marrow extracted. This all suggested that the people had fallen victim to cannibalism by other Neanderthals. Other food sources found in the same caves, such as reindeer and horses, had been prepared in the same way. Furthermore, the thigh bones and shin bones were then used as napping tools. This wasn't the first time that archaeologists discovered signs of cannibalism in Neanderthal society, showing us that this was not a one-off event. All the way back in the 1990s, researchers found the remains of 6 Neanderthals, including 2 children, in France. They had the same marks as the others, but they also had finger bones, which had been chewed on by Neanderthal teeth. Number 2. A Mysterious Massacre. The locals of Öland Island in Sweden knew to stay away from the ruins of Sandby Borg and even warned the archaeologists who visited the place to do the same. A few seasons of excavations showed them why. A brutal death was the fate of all the people who once lived in the prosperous village 1,500 years ago. They were massacred in their homes. It was swift and merciless, and we have no idea who did it or why. All that remains today of Sandby Borg is a large green mound, but in the 5th century it was a ring fort which surrounded 53 homes. In 2010, after hearing that the area might be a target for looters, researchers decided to investigate to see if there was anything there. Very quickly they started finding treasure, and a lot of it. Jewelry, glass beads, Roman coins, decorations, and hair ornaments. They had all been buried hastily and never touched again. Then they also started finding the bodies. The victims had been killed and left to rot where they fell, although some of them them appear to have been thrown in hearths. Fragments from tiny bones showed that the children were not spared. Some may even have been desecrated after death, such as a man's skull that was found stuffed with sheep's teeth. Archaeologists have found no written or oral account of what happened at Sandby Borg. We don't know who massacred the villagers or why, although it is clear they didn't do it for the money because they didn't bother to dig up any of the loot. The place became taboo for locals, who left it alone for centuries and never resettled it. In turn, this is a boon for modern archaeologists who get a unique, albeit indirectly grim look at an ancient society during the migration period. Number 1. Mutiny, Murder and Mayhem on the Batavia. 2 years ago, archaeologists exploring the islands off the coast of Western Australia found a mass grave containing 5 people. Their bodies had been arranged neatly and placed in a row, showing no signs of violence. Although grim, one could say that they were the lucky ones because those 5 people had been passengers on the Batavia, a ship which once saw one of the bloodiest, most depraved mutinies in history. In 1628, the Batavia sailed on its maiden voyage from Amsterdam, headed for the Dutch East Indies, with 341 people on board. It was part of a convoy, but a violent storm separated it from the rest. Tensions were running high between the commander of the voyage, Francisco Pelsaert, and his second and third in command, ship's captain Arian Jacobs, and junior merchant Geronimus Cornelis. The latter two planned to mutiny. Would they have done it if the ship had stayed on course? We'll never know, because on June 4th, 1629, the ship wrecked off Australia's Beacon Island. Around 40 people drowned, but the rest made it to land. After the survivors were safe, Pelsaert organized a party with Jacobs, the senior officers, soldiers, and some passengers to search for a water source. Pelsaert's voyage was supposed to be the dangerous part. He ended up sailing for over a month until he reached the city of Batavia, where he received another ship to return for the other survivors. He had no idea what hell had broken loose on the island following his departure. Cornelis had organized a mutiny. He'd gotten rid of the other able men by sending them in search of water, not expecting any to return. All of whom remained were the ill and feeble, as well as women and children. Most of them were tortured and killed, except for some of the women who were kept alive to be raped. Eventually, Pelsaert returned with soldiers and hanged the mutineers, but not before 125 people died during the massacre. The story of the Batavia is still being told, as archaeologists make new discoveries that point to the horrors that took place on Beacon Island. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. For more from me, why not check out my other channel called Geographics? If you like this video, I think you'll like that. It's obviously a geography themed channel, so please find that linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.